Welcome back to Massacre on Muriel Court. This week I'd like to tell you about a man named William Thoreson III. He was born on October 9th, 1937 and grew up in the wealthiest part of Chicago. Son of William Thoreson II, who was founder and president of Chicago's Great Western Steel Company, Thoreson and his brother Richard were spoiled kids. They grew up having everything they wanted and then some. Thoreson III liked to be called Wild Bill, which is fitting, so for this, we'll call him that from now on. Wild Bill was quite handsome and obviously rich, but neither of those qualities could keep him out of trouble. Some believe that Wild Bill started acting out because of his severe speech impediment, a stutter. Later in life, he would get over his stutter and speak with almost perfect dictation. Remember back in episode 2 when we talked about the phone call originating from Brevard County, and the caller claimed that he had, quote, done a horrible thing. I have killed 3 people. When Wild Bill was about 13, he started getting into trouble for breaking into homes in the neighborhood he lived in, called Kenilworth, the same neighborhood Valerie Percy was murdered in. According to Classic Chicago magazine, after more troubling behavior around the age of 17, Wild Bill's family placed him in a mental ward at Michael Reese Hospital in Chicago, one of at least 3 trips to mental hospitals in his life. But he escaped, returned home, locked himself in a room with a gun, and said he would kill anyone who entered.
It's mostly quiet on Muriel Court, but that wasn't the case in 1966 when Robert Sims, his wife Helen, and young daughter Joy found gagged, stabbed, and shot to death.
Safer politically to leave it alone. Moronic is the word that comes to mind.
He's accusing 2 top officials of a cover-up.
Standing back there under the banana tree.
Surveillance video of a 1966 FSU football game may be the key to cracking the code in this case gone cold.
You do that.
And while state officials aren't releasing details regarding suspects or persons of interest, they did stress their commitment to finding the Sims killers.
Oh, I think you did it. All of a sudden you became absolutely down, totally obsessed with that.
It's a case that we would certainly like to see solved, and investigators are actively working on the case.
By age 18, Wild Bill had become obsessed with guns, buying and stealing as many as he could. At 19, he was questioned about the murder of a teenage neighbor. On the evening of August 16, 1957, 15-year-old Judith Mae Anderson called to ask her mother if she could stay late at a friend's house. Her mother told her no, and expected Judy to come home in about 20 minutes, since that was the normal amount of time it took her to walk home. Judith Mae Anderson did not make it home that night. On August 23rd, a cut-down 50-gallon metal oil drum was found floating in the Montrose Harbor. Inside was a nude torso, legs, left arm, elbow, and wrist. The next day, another metal barrel is found floating in the Montrose Harbor. Inside are more human remains. The body was identified as Judith Mae Anderson. It is determined that Judith probably was shot 4 times in the head, 24 to 72 hours before the remains were discovered. Inside the barrels, authorities found residue of chemicals used in steel making. Now remember, Wild Bill's father was the president of Chicago's Great Western Steel Company. Wild Bill became a suspect in the case after talking about chopping up bodies and stuffing them in barrels to some of his friends. One of those friends notified police. His family tried to have him committed again, but this time, with the aid of his girlfriend, Louise Bannock, escaped on the way to the mental health facility and ran to Indiana. Louise was a school teacher and a speech therapist. She was actually tutoring him to help him with his stutter. He and Louise married in Indiana. He started beating Louise before the ink on the marriage certificate dried. Louise claimed she stayed with him because she was manipulated by Bill with stories of his unhappy childhood and the prospect of $1 million family inheritance. She stayed even after she found out that the only reason he married her was to escape commitment by his family to another state mental institution. Not long after the marriage, Wild Bill was charged with assault of a Kenilworth man. In the late 50s, his mother Kay filed assault and battery charges against him. He later tried to stage a murder-suicide in his parents' home and blame it on his father. In 1960, Wild Bill and his wife Louise purchased a home in Tempe, Arizona. 2 years later, in 1962, their son Michael was born, and Bill bought a bright red Ferrari with the allowance money his wealthy parents sent him. Later that year, Wild Bill was indicted for sexual assault in Santa Monica, California. In a New York Times article titled, "Life with a Wealthy, Sadistic, Murderous Lunatic," written by Louise Thoreson in 1974, Louise described just that, life with a wealthy, sadistic, murderous lunatic. William Thoreson III was unusually angry, a loner, hostile, destructive, and rather open about it. He started traveling quite often and would leave Louise at home. He was basically living the life of a rich bachelor, partying and sleeping with lots of women. Louise knew what he was up to, but she rarely brought it up because he would beat her when she did. He made frequent trips back home to Kenilworth. One of William's favorite spots to travel was to California. He fell in love with San Francisco and would often tell Louise how he wanted to move there, but they did not have the money for it. But in 1965, after Wild Bill's younger brother Richard was murdered by the hitman that Bill had hired, Bill used credit against his brother's estate to purchase a mansion in San Francisco. And yes, you heard me correctly, Wild Bill hired a hitman to kill his younger brother Richard. A lot happened over the next 5 years, including Louise murdering her husband, Wild Bill, and being found not guilty. There's too much to cover, and much of it has nothing to do with the Sims murder, but some of it does. Also, could William Thoreson III actually have been the Zodiac killer? Now, because I used the book Zodiac Maniac, written by Glenn Wall, for so much of my research on this portion of our story, I invited Glenn to come speak with me, as he seems to be an expert of sorts on William Thoreson. Let's have a listen to his ideas after the break. So, hey everyone, this is Lauren back at you with Massacre on Muriel Court, and today I have Glenn Wall with me, author of the book Zodiac Maniac. Hi, Glenn.
Hi.
Thank you so much for joining me and talking to me about your book and the Zodiac and the possible connection to the Sims murder.
Thank you for having me.
Well, as you know, I'm working on a deep dive into the murder of the Sims family in Tallahassee in 1966. And during my research, I kept coming across all these connections or possible connections to other cases, such as the Bricka family murders, Valerie Percy's murder, the Bowles family. And then I keep coming across possible connections to the Zodiac killer, which led me to your book, Zodiac Maniac. So what I did was I purchased your book and I figured, hey, I'm just going to take a shot in the dark and see if I can get in contact with you and see if I can just get you to tell me what your thoughts are on particularly the Sims case, but also any connections with the Bricka and Valerie Percy. And particularly, I really want you to give me a quick rundown of who was William Thoreson III and what kind of person was he?
Well, when you're talking specifically about the Sims case,
I think that it's important to keep in mind that, we're all viewing this from now, and anybody who's looked into homicides and serial killings and murder and all these kinds of things should keep in mind that they've probably somewhere along the line looked at cases from the 70s and the 80s. And because of that, you got to keep in mind that 1966, the 1960s were a very different time than for these kinds of things compared to, say, 1974 and on, roughly. I'm just picking that year. But about that time, I think, because of the demographic changes that happened in the United States from the baby boomers becoming teenagers and such in the 1970s, the big population boom. So while serial killers and murder and homicide go back as far as recorded history, one should keep in mind that we're talking about 1966 with the Sims case or Zodiac or any of that kind of stuff. We're talking, probably ending around 1970. So, we should keep in mind that these kinds of things, while they may have been rare at any time in history, were even more so in 1966 when the Sims case happened.
Right.
So we're talking about, very rare kind of murder or mass murder in this case. As far as William Thoreson goes, he is someone that I came across almost accidentally. I was investigating the Percy case at the time, which, as you know, happened just not much more than a month before the Sims case. And I came across him through a source in the town where Valerie Percy was murdered, which was Kenilworth, Illinois. It was a police source who told me about him. And I learned about him not in the context of the Percy case, but just in the context of somebody who worked in the police department in that town at that time, and about how he was the oldest of two sons born to an extremely wealthy couple. His father made a fortune in the steel business during World War II in Chicago, and they had children pretty late for that time. I would have to look up, but I believe his mother was in her late 30s when she had him. She may have even been 40 or older when she had his younger brother, who was about 4 or 5 years younger. He was involved in crime from about the age of 13 onwards, entering neighbors' homes without permission, stealing, burglarizing Chicago area businesses. Just a troublemaker. He was institutionalized several times when he was a teenager. I think that his parents thought he was crazy, but I think in reality, he wasn't crazy. He was just a sociopath and drawn to crime. Okay.
Now, when he was 19, correct me if I'm wrong, that was the first murder he was questioned about and or suspected of, the murder of Judith Mae Anderson. Is that correct?
That's as far as I know.
Okay. And how many people do you think he killed?
I have him down for 47 in the book,
wow.
In the Zodiac Maniac book. That includes murders he was presumed to have committed. He was never caught or tried or charged with murder, but his wife was tried for his killing.
Right.
And during that trial, it looks like you could presume that he murdered 3 people, including his younger brother.
Well, and I was going to ask you about his brother as well. Now, do you think that he actually murdered his brother, or did he hire someone to murder his brother?
He hired someone to murder his brother. And where legally that comes into saying he committed murder, obviously didn't do it personally. He hired someone to do it. And his wife apparently convinced a jury that he murdered the person that he hired to do it.
I did dig into Louise's. I didn't read her book, but I dug into a lot of the things that she said. So William Thoreson was basically a troublemaker. He grew up very wealthy in Chicago, in Kenilworth, which is where Valerie Percy was murdered.
Right.
And what made you put the connection between William Thoreson and Valerie Percy?
When I was reading William's wife's book, she gets to a point a month or two before the Percy murder and talks about how she and William toured. They went to Fort Bragg for a unveiling ceremony and toured an exhibit of military weaponry, and he became obsessed with military weaponry. Now, he'd been obsessed with guns since he was a teenager and was, very into firearms. But at that point, she says he became obsessed with military weaponry of all types, not just guns, but everything. And landmines and cannons and knives and the whole thing. So I was reading the book and that popped out because I knew that police had discovered a bayonet in the lake right down the beach from Percy's house 3 days after Valerie was murdered. And the bayonet was found in the direction of footprints that led from the door of the house where Valerie's killer broke in. And it was found about 40 feet off of shore, which I think one investigator said would be about as far as someone could throw a knife like that. It was down about 4 feet of water. These were beaches that were widely used at that time of year and in the months preceding this. This happened in the final days of summer. There were big families, very prosperous area. Many people would crash the beaches. These were private beaches, but they would crash the beaches. And they got a lot of use. So the idea that that knife was sitting there in 4 feet of water is a huge 16-inch bayonet wouldn't seem to indicate that it was there for very long. Also, there was a pommel on that type of bayonet, which is used for hand-to-hand combat and hitting people, striking people. And there's a triangular tip to that pommel. And in the days before they found the bayonet, there was speculation as to what caused Valerie's head wounds. And they talked about the triangular shaped wounds and there was speculation as to whether that was a fireplace poker or something. But the pathologist who conducted her autopsy, or a pathologist in the morgue that conducted her autopsy, told a Chicago investigator that Valerie's wounds were consistent with the bayonet. And I went and talked to somebody who runs a website on bayonets and described her wounds and the type of bayonet. And he said that would be something that you would expect, that those triangular type of wounds would be expected from a weapon like that.
So, and this just popped in my head as you were explaining that. In the Bricca case, Mr. and Mrs. Bricca had wounds on their head that they couldn't say they were stab wounds. They just said that they were wounds on the head, but then they were definitely stabbed. And now I know in Bricca, they assumed that the murder weapon was a knife that came from the home, from a set that had been taken from the kitchen. But now you've got me thinking it could be, how do we explain those head wounds on?
Well, right. And it's a similar type of attack, right? These people were stabbed, but they were also pummeled. It would be expected that they were alive at that time. So my belief was, with the Bricca case, I believe that the Briccas were murdered by whoever murdered Valerie Percy for a variety of reasons. It was a home invasion. It was in one thing that the Percy case, the Bricca case, and the Sims case have in common is they all took place in places with basically no major crimes, especially nothing like this, like these kinds of things. So they have those in common. So you would say, okay, if this was the same person, they were trolling for victims. And if these were random crimes, they were trolling for people in areas that were similar, where they weren't going down to the bad neighborhoods in the city to do this. They were doing this in low crime, family oriented, prosperous communities. I also thought that another reason I thought that it was the same person was Robert Lamb, who I interviewed many times for the Percy case, went down to Cincinnati and interviewed, met with police there and said that it was the same suspect or the same killer. Another reason is I am skeptical about that. While it's possible that someone came in, found a knife on the premises and did this, I was skeptical of the description of the knife. It sounded like, a mass-produced kind of inexpensive set of knives that many people would have had. And I was keeping in mind that when the Brickas were murdered, the bayonet had just been found in the Percy case. And the publicity from the Percy case was quite, it was a nationwide publicity because she was the daughter of a multimillionaire. This happened in a place where such crimes, it was the first murder in Kenilworth's 75-year history. And also, she was from a family that was in the public eye because her father was running for the U.S. Senate at the time and won not much more than a month later. So it seems that police and investigators in Ohio would have been aware of the Percy case, quite likely prior to the Bricka murders, even though these were just a matter of days. So, there was the news about the bayonet. The bayonet was only found on Wednesday, and the Brickas were murdered as soon as Saturday night. So I think that police may, if this was a bayonet attack, they would have kept that detail out of the papers, I think.
In the Bricka case.
Right. And it would have been quite easy for them to say there was a knife missing or, just they don't have to prove what they're saying. They just can say it.
Right. Exactly. So the only, comparing and contrasting Percy and Bricka to the Sims murder weapon was never found, but there was 2 murder weapons. All 3 of the Sims victims were shot, and only 12-year-old Joy Sims was stabbed. What do you make of the gun being involved in Sims and not being involved in the other cases?
Well, Judith Mae Anderson was shot. And William was obsessed with guns going back to being a teenager. So I wouldn't count out anything, as far as a firearm in attacks from him. And you bring up some interesting points. You not only have the similarity between the communities where these attacks happen and them being home invasions and them being senseless murders. We have the Sims. Weren't the Sims tied up and gagged?
Yes.
So were the Brickas. So this indicates to me that these people were cooperating with this person who invaded their home under, believing that this was a burglary and he was going to take a few things and leave. And then he just kills them and doesn't take anything. And that's a similarity between all 3 of these cases. We have nothing taken. I'm not sure about the Bricka. I believe so, but I know that in the Percy case, cash was left in the room that Valerie Percy was murdered in. I believe that was true of the Sims case as well. And I don't believe there was any burglary or theft evidence in any of these cases.
Well, and I can just tell you that in Bricka, from my research, the only thing that I have found, obviously, was the supposed murder weapon was taken. And they said that Mr. Bricka's wallet was out and open and there was no cash in it. But we don't know if there was cash in it to begin with. So we don't know if something was taken or not. And in Sims, it was the same situation. There was money out in the open, and there was also a very expensive coin collection in the master bedroom where all the victims were found, and that wasn't taken.
Right.
So robbery was not the motive in any of these cases, I don't believe. Right.
But and you have these people, you have the adults tied up. So that would give you the impression that these people were led to believe that this was a burglary and they were just going to be tied up and robbed, and that was going to be it. And then they were attacked. And of course, not jumping ahead too far, but in various Zodiac and suspected Zodiac cases, people were tied up, led to believe that they were going to be at Lake Berryessa, led to believe that they were going to be robbed, and then they were attacked. So that's a similarity. Also, between Sims and Bricka, you have children murdered, which was an extremely rare occurrence. A 4-year-old and a 12-year-old. That's something else that the Sims and Bricka cases have in common. As for the Percy case, one of the things that made that different is that the killer was confronted by an eyewitness at the scene and ran out of the house. So I would presume that the rest of the Percys would have been attacked had that not happened.
And that was the first one.
Right.
So it almost seems like he's evolving.
Well, we have September 18th. We have September 18th for Percy. Bricka was September 25th, and the Sims are October 22nd.
Okay, so quick question. In your book, you said that in the Bricka case, the Hamilton County Sheriff's Deputy Ray Hoffbauer witnessed a man in a beige jacket standing in the dark.
Engaged him in conversation.
Right. And then another neighbor saw this same description, a man making strange gestures.
A couple of blocks away.
So in the Sims case, there was almost identical a description of a man in
of
the
way
area.
The man spoke.
Of the way he spoke, and also he was standing in the street making strange gestures as if he was speaking to somebody or trying to get someone's attention. The description of the man is very, very similar. So I find that to be super interesting.
You're saying that in the Sims case,
yes,
there was someone was seen, a suspect was seen by someone?
Yes.
I know that there was a phone call that was overheard.
Yes, there was a phone call.
And there was information in the phone call which police believed only the killer could have known about the Sims murders.
Okay, so in what I have in my research, a young boy coming home from a football game at 11:15 p.m., driving down Gibbs Drive, saw a young man walking from Muriel Court towards Von Zile Avenue. This man was about 21 years old, tall and slender, wore glasses. And then another neighbor saw the same description, a tall, slender man about 21 years old, wearing glasses, out in the street, waving his arms, and appeared to be gesturing to someone, but who he was gesturing to, who we were talking to, is unknown. And this is all on the evening after the murders had already occurred.
After the Sims murders had occurred.
Right.
Well, it wouldn't surprise me if he had been, I know that in the Bricka case, the person that observed the suspect in that case thought that this person might have been trying to psych themselves up to do something, as in talking to themselves. That was another possibility. Thoreson was about 28 at the time, but these people were seeing these people at night.
Yes, in the dark.
Seeing suspects at night. And Thoreson was a young guy who looks to have worked out. So he was a physically fit guy, and he was also considered, I have reason to believe women believed he was attractive. And so, all of these kinds of things could have been factors there.
Okay.
He was about 6'1", which in those days would be considered taller than it would today.
Right. And that's the description that the neighbors gave the police in the Sims case. But I see the difference here is this strange man, if it was the same person, was spotted before the Bricka murders, but then after the Sims murders, as if he kind of hung around.
Yes. And the Percy murder happened at 5 o'clock in the morning, which is a very unusual hour for murder to occur.
Right.
It's sort of too late to be early and too early to be late. It nothing going on at 5 o'clock in the morning and on a Sunday. The other thing that these murders had in common, I believe, is they all took place on weekends, right?
Yes.
Percy was a Sunday. Bricka was presumed to be a Saturday night or early Sunday morning. And the Sims was a Saturday, right?
Right. Correct. Okay.
So they have that in common. But, or what the witnesses saw, I wasn't aware I guess I could imagine that people saw somebody in the neighborhood that night, whether or not it was a suspect in the Sims case. I would have to know a little bit tall, that basic description fits him. If somebody was a little bit more specific as to how tall, that would help. I wouldn't be surprised if people thought Thoreson was in his early 20s when he was really in his late 20s, because he was a youthful looking guy.
Well, and you just kind of gave me the perfect segue into my next question. And well, first, let me tell you that I'm trying to get these details down. And
well, before we leave your topic of what witnesses saw, we have to keep in mind that the Percy case, a witness described as a Northwestern University student who may have been working a delivery job or something, saw someone staring at the Percy's house the night before the murders, standing outside looking at the house. I have not seen anything beyond what was in the newspapers about that, but we know that with the Bricka case, an off-duty policeman that you mentioned engaged someone in conversation who was standing there looking at the Bricka's house. And that's another thing the two things have in common.
Okay. I hadn't heard that about the Percy case.
There was a big battle about 6 years ago. A lawyer from New York was trying to access the Percy police records on the investigation and lost a Freedom of Information Act suit. And my belief is the reason why, and police and officials involved in that suit were extremely secretive of this murder that was 50 years old at the time. And my belief is that there's information in there they didn't want to get out because of what we're talking about. And one of the reasons is I've looked at enough police reports and things and seen the kinds of things witnesses report. There are a lot of really good witnesses in a lot of these cases. And I believe that you would find just the description of the man seen looking at the Percy's house would probably fit Thoreson. And I think that's one of the reasons, but just one of the reasons that they fought so hard to keep that lawyer from accessing those records.
Well, and you actually just went in the exact direction that I was going. I was just getting ready to tell you when I said you gave me the perfect segue, is I have requested the Sims files from Tallahassee. Mm-hmm. And of course they refused. And I have filed a FOIA request and I have heard nothing back.
Right.
I have been in touch with Jeremy Mutz and he basically told me, good luck,
Right.
And there's something with the Sims. There's something not right. There's some reason why.
Well, what you just mentioned, I don't think it's a coincidence that the year, I think it was 2016, that this lawyer, John Kelly out of New York, filed that FOIA case and then sued Kenilworth over that. I don't think it's a coincidence that the judge that made the decision to keep those files sealed said that described the Percy case as an ongoing active investigation. Well, that same year, Jeremy was, I believe, let go from his job for investigating the Sims case, and his supervisor or boss, I believe, said the exact same thing, that he was investigating an ongoing, this was an ongoing investigation. Both of these cases were cold as can be, half a century old, and both his dismissal and the reason to keep the Percy case file sealed, suspiciously, the reason is exactly the same, which indicates to me that there was somebody working at a higher level giving the officials on the local scene the excuse to prevent further investigation.
So that was going to be my question. Well, my next question is why? Why prevent further investigation? Why can't we just get these cases solved? I think they're all very solvable.
Well, for years in the Zodiac case, people have been saying that they believe that there was a cover-up. And I believe I've, as far as Thoreson goes, presented information, documentary evidence that it was a cover-up. The mailings the so-called Zodiac mailings that arrived, the first two that arrived right at the time Thoreson died, changed markedly on the envelopes. And the officials declared that they were legit anyway, whereas all of the previous mailings contained two stamps on them and had some sort of notation using the word editor, saying rush to editor or attention editor. And then all of a sudden that disappears and they say these are legit. These are genuine. And it just so happens that Thoreson died just before those changes arrived on the scene, about 2 weeks, about as long as it would take, you would think, for them to figure this out and send some mailings through the mail. So there's a lot of suspicious stuff. I would say that's evidence that, for my conclusions regarding this. But I have a manuscript I'm working now. It's 86,000 words. And I think it answers some more questions about Thoreson. As to how many murders he actually committed, I don't know. I've been looking at the guy for 12 years, and I've only recently kind of come to the conclusion. If you wanted to tell people what he was like, to me, it seems he was like Ted Bundy with money, and Ted Bundy was a guy who murdered people in 4 states, including Florida and Washington State, which couldn't be further apart, and did so with a Volkswagen Beetle. Thoreson drove a Ferrari, and he had the equivalent of millions of dollars at his dismissal, or at his disposal.
And it didn't say Ferrari, but it said a very fancy standout red car was seen parked near the Bricka murders.
And when you mentioned indications that this killer hung around for a while, or, that fits, is that true in the Sims case?
I don't think they hung around in the home.
Right, because the daughter came home. One of the other daughters came home.
Well, and here, let me hit you with this. There is speculation that when she came home, the side door leading out to the carport was open and the front door was closed. She found it odd that the side door was open, but she went inside and then she discovered her family. She ran back out to the kitchen to use the phone, and she sees that the front door was open, which pretty much is pretty convinced that it was closed. So the killer may still have been in the house when she first entered.
Right. Well, it wouldn't surprise me because if this was Thoreson, because with the Percy case, you have this person ran out of the house. They ran south down the beach, about 800 feet from Percy's house. They found the knife in the lake, but they found a glove on a shrub in the northeast corner of Percy's house, which is the opposite direction. And that to me indicates that he ran south, threw the knife in the water, and came back up the beach towards Percy's house and lost that glove on the shrub. And and that's another reason to believe he's Zodiac. This guy was so brazen and so confident. All of these things seem to indicate that. Now, he would have known Kenilworth well. Kenilworth was a very small town, and they usually didn't have more than 2 police officers on duty at a time, or 2 police representatives. And one of them would have been in the station. So the first police responding to the scene, it probably would have just been one in a car, and he could have observed all of that.
So how do you connect William Thoreson to Florida and in particular the Sims murder? Is it just because of the MO, or is there anything else that you believe connects him?
Well, I know that in her book in 1968 or so, may have been 69, William's wife wrote that he took their son on vacation to Florida. But I believe that when we're talking about the Percy case with the bayonet, reasons to believe that perhaps police were misleading people as to what the knife really was in the Bricka case. And then with the Sims case, we have the description from the pathologist who did the autopsies, or did the autopsy on the youngest victim, that she was stabbed with a knife that was large, double-edged, and I think he said something about there were three descriptions of the knife. It was large, wide-bladed, and probably double-edged, or possibly double-edged. That's synonymous with a bayonet. And a bayonet is really not, it's as much like a sword as it is like a knife. It's not really, it's like a mini sword. So
Right.
It's very different than if someone stabs someone with a knife. So that to me puts Thoreson there, because having talked to the investigators that I talked to about the Percy case, who had seen, these guys worked in Northern Illinois for the state police, Robert Lamb, and Joe DiLenardi became a homicide commander in Chicago and before becoming acting superintendent of police. These guys had worked and knowledge of thousands of murders. And I asked them, is there any other one you can remember hearing about where a civilian was purportedly or, presumably or otherwise could have been attacked by someone with a bayonet? And they said no. And so I said, this would be unusual, seriously rare occurrence. And they said, absolutely. So that to me puts him at the Sims house. And then you have the phone call where the person overhears this person with information that only the killer would have known. And they're described, the person who overheard the conversation remembered the way that this person spoke. Can't remember, you've probably got the description there, but it was there was something unnatural about their diction. And that is almost exactly what the off-duty policeman who engaged the person who was watching the Bricka's house the night before the murder said about the way that person spoke. It was like an unnaturally perfect delivery. And Thoreson's stuttering was well documented in his wife's book. It's documented in his FBI file, and that his wife took speech therapy classes to help him. I interviewed someone who knew him and who knew him since childhood and said that he had improved in that regard, but he never spoke like that had never been an issue.
Right. So what I have actually is that the telephone call was overheard and they somehow narrowed it down to either coming or going from Brevard County, Florida, which is on the east coast of Florida, just east of Orlando.
Mm-hmm.
And on November 30th of 1966, the Brevard County Sheriff's Office actually announced that they had someone in custody for questioning in the Sims murder case in Brevard County. Now we're talking like 500-600 miles away from Tallahassee.
Mm-hmm.
And reports indicate that the man that they had in custody was a former mental patient.
Well, that does not rule out Thoreson by any means.
I know. That's why I'm telling you my connections that I've made. This is why right. I think this is such a great discussion that we're having.
You have found some really great information.
Right. And that's why when the Zodiac first entered into my realm here, I was like, oh my gosh, somebody's wearing a tinfoil hat, but now it's not right. So much the Zodiac as William Thoreson, but now I want to ask you, what makes you so sure that William Thoreson was the Zodiac? Okay, I know I left you guys on a little bit of a cliffhanger there, but don't worry, because next week we're going to play the second part of my interview with Glenn Wall. But first, Let's unpack a few things we just learned from this portion of the interview. First, the phone call overheard in Brevard County, Florida. Again, the caller said he had done a horrible thing. I have killed 3 people. Almost perfect dictation, just the way William Thoreson spoke. Brevard County investigators announced they had someone in custody, a former mental patient. Thoreson was a former mental patient. Obviously, they must have let that person go and nothing ever came of it. But why? Thoreson has been connected to murders involving guns, knives, and possibly a bayonet. In the Bricka case, the head wounds possibly matched the pommel from a bayonet. A pommel is an enlarged fitting at the top of the handle of a sword or bayonet. Valerie Percy had some of the same types of wounds on her head. Burglary was ruled out as a motive in the Bricka, Percy, and Sims case. In both the Bricka and the Sims cases, a young man of similar description was spotted making strange gestures near the crime scene. Bricka before the murders and Sims just after the murders. 2 different jurisdictions, a judge in Illinois and the Leon County Sheriff's Office, made almost identical excuses in and around 2016 when outsiders attempted to get a look at the case files for Percy in Illinois and the Sims in Tallahassee. So who might be running the show here? These cases are so old and so cold. Why do officials seem to not want them solved? Join me next week for episode 8 of Massacre on Muriel Court, where we will finish our interview with Glenn Wall and unpack some more interesting information about the connections made to the Sims murder. Massacre on Muriel Court is researched, written, and produced by me, Lauren Samples. If you'd like to support the show, please consider joining our Palmahawk Media Patreon page at patreon.com/Palmahawk Media. That's PALMAHAWK Media. On Patreon, you'll receive early and ad-free episodes of this show and our sister show, Paradise After Dark, along with exclusive content for both shows. Thanks for listening.